Chapter 4. If you are a free person, that's a racist. If you hate, this is one of the few places where you can come and exercise it with encouragement and impunity. The emphasis of this institution is man's inhumanity against man, and to oppress an inmate at any cost. There's a penalty here for being respectable to an inmate. Inmate, Stateville Prison, Joliet, Illinois. Prison is a jungle where the strong survive and only the strong. It's not so different from life in that respect, except that a penitentiary is a zoo and the inmates are caged animals. They're fed like animals, treated like animals, and encouraged to behave like animals towards one another. The meals are slopped on metal plates just like they are for animals in a zoo. The food itself, basically starch and pork, is geared to keep a human functioning on the dullest animal level. There is nothing in the prison to help a man remember that he is a human being who can evolve out of his past mistakes. Everything points to his failures and hammers it into his consciousness. Respect is quickly forgotten. None is shown to convicts by any prison administrator or guard, except the respect won by being the toughest animal and causing the greatest fear. I once heard a politician say that the law of survival meant that if you're going to survive, you must be king. In the joint, if you have any intentions on surviving, you got to be the king animal. How you relate to people here is completely different from how you're used to relating on the outside. You can't be nice. Nice guys don't last. You quickly find out that kindness is a weakness in the joint. If you tell a guy, yeah, I'll loan you $1, he'll think, look at this weak son of a bitch. He's easy. I'll hit him for $50 next time. Or he'll come back every week for that same dollar or that same candy bar you first offered. It's one big head game that breaks down the golden rule of survival in the convict jungle. Do unto others before they do it to you. I first arrived at the penitentiary of New Mexico on a 10 to 50 year armed robbery conviction in 1962. 22 years old and scared shitless. I'd been prepared for the hard facts of prison life by some parole violators in the county jail who were there while I was waiting to be sentenced. They told me that if I was going to make it, I'd have to stand up for myself the first time something came down. And plenty, they said, would come down. The majority of the population at the time was Chicano, some 600 of them, with about 200 blacks and only 100 whites. For the first time in my life, I was going to be part of a minority group, an even more vulnerable position in a prison that is in the outside world. They warned me that when young white guys came in the population at Santa Fe, which we call the penitentiary because of its proximity to that city, they'd get hit on for a piece of ass. The new white boy had a choice: stand up for himself or get pushed to the limit for the rest of his time there. My first month was spent in quarantine, where all newcomers are kept for 30 days while they're given a battery of physical, mental, and emotional tests before joining the rest of the prison population. While all this is done, I've never understood. The administration certainly never used the results to help rehabilitate anyone. And many men with psychological problems were sent to coexist with the general prison population. Nevertheless, a week after I'd been released from quarantine, I had a chance to prove what kind of convict I was going to be. I've been assigned to a dormitory, a dangerous place for a novice to the prison game. A convict didn't get a cell of his own until he'd done some time and proven he wasn't a troublemaker. Once he earned it, he'd be given a cell house unit and a house. He'd be free to move in population for meals and work, but at night he'd have the luxury of a locked cell where nobody could attack him. Then the sound of metal doors snapping shut would be a welcome one. But in the dormitories, when the door clanked every night at lockup, it was time to be on guard. For the first few months, that sound sent chills up my spine, but eventually I got used to it. In prison, you adjust to closing metal doors or you go crazy. In prison, you adjust to every kind of inhumanity or you go berserk. I was sitting on my bunk one Saturday afternoon when a black convict walked up to me. "Hey, how about helping us out?" he said. I asked him what he meant. "Well, we've been checking you out, and me and a couple buddies decided we want to fuck your butt." God damn, just like that. All the white guys that come in here, they all turn around and help out the brothers. And the brothers go ahead and take care of them. Well, we'll take care of you too. We won't let the Mexicans fuck you. I told them I wasn't interested. Well, if you don't, we'll just come over tonight and take it anyway. So just think about how you want it. Bareback or raw? I was a fairly naive 22-year-old and had never been approached by a man sexually. I also held the racial prejudices that were as normal among white folks in 1962 as apple pie and mom were. So the prospect that stared me in the face was triply offensive. Fortunately, I made the acquaintance of an old-timer in another unit, and I went to him with my problem. He listened and was typically non-committal. Well, what do you want to do about it? He asked me. I told him I only knew I didn't want to do anything with the dude and asked what he thought I should do about it. If you don't stand up to them now, they're going to go ahead and fuck you and you're going to end up a jailhouse punk. You have a hard way to go that way. I've seen a lot of white boys get fucked by the blacks and the Chicanos in the 5 years I've been here. Most of them were raped and they all became punks, jailhouse ladies. If you stand up to them, you might get your ass whooped. But when it's all over, they won't bother you no more. I explained that standing up to them was what I had in mind, but the guy that approached me was big, plus he had friends. How was I going to fight them all and come out alive? I got something that'll help you, he told me, stomping out the butt of his camel. He left his bunk and went into the shower room. When he came back, he handed me a 2-foot piece of radiator pipe, which I quickly put down my trousers, holding it against my thigh with one hand. He hadn't sawed off the pipe in that quick trip. He just had his personal arsenal of weapons stashed somewhere in the lavatory. It was for just such battles that these weapon stashes were kept by most of the hardcore cons. That night, I lay on top of my bunk, waiting, the pipe beside me. At about 1:30 in the morning, I saw my would-be attacker walking up the aisle toward me. I tensed and took a deep breath. He reached my bed and whispered, "Hey, you ready, boy?" I told him, "Yeah, I was ready." "Okay," he said in a satisfied low voice. "Let's go to the day room. We got something for you you're gonna love." Some black radiator pipe. I got up and he started walking in front of me. I thought to myself, I got something for you too, sucker. He didn't quite get to turn around before I slammed the pipe against the side of his head. He didn't go down, just stood there like he was in shock. His eyes wide, staring at me as if he couldn't understand how this could happen to him. I hit him again, this time across the collarbone. He let out a short yell and fell over backwards. I let him lay there and went toward the day room for his buddies. There was only one, and he was standing in the doorway, alerted by his friend's yell. "What's happening? Where's Brother Jones?" he asked, apparently not seeing the pipe in my hand. "Brother Jones isn't coming tonight," I answered and swung the pipe into his face. He wailed in pain, then started yelling for help. He got it. The lights went on and 4 guards raced into the dormitory. My 2 victims had to go to the hospital, but not before the last one I hit told the man that I'd attacked them for no apparent reason. I gave my side of the story, but I was still thrown in the maximum detention unit, the whole. I guess they figured the 2 blacks had gotten punishment enough for my beating, because I was the only one who got sent there. My crash course in prison survival had begun. It was a survival that required I develop the emotional, mental, and physical sensitivity of an armored combat tank. The hole is located in the basement under cell block 3, the lockup unit for troublemakers, and just behind death row. I always thought that was ironic. Like waiting on death row for that long, legally delayed date with cyanide. Being in the hole could make a man wish he were dead. There are 10 holes, 6 by 9 foot cells with no window, no ventilation, no lights, just darkness. 2 of the 10 holes are padded for the more violent resistor. Most of the time, you're stripped and thrown in naked, as I was. All you're allowed is a thin blanket, a toothbrush, and a metal cup. A mattress is given to you at 10 at night and taken away at 6 in the morning. They feed you one meal every 3 days and 6 slices of white bread for the 2 days in between. There's a faucet in the cell, but there's water in it only when the guards come and turns it on from the outside. He does that 3 times a day, morning, noon, and evening. You've got nothing to store the water in, so you've got to drink what you can, wash up, and fill your cup so you've got some to last till the next time it's turned on. It's a thirsty stretch from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. with 1 cup of water. The toilet is a hole in the floor that you squat over. It flushes from the outside. The guards think it's funny not to flush it for a few days in a row, playing their little mind games with you, asking every time they come by, does it smell pretty good in there? When it's hot, like it was when I went in there the first time, it got to stinking pretty bad. There isn't any toilet paper either, so even if they kept the thing flush, after a few days, you get to smelling pretty rank yourself. In the winter, it's freezing cold, so you don't have to worry about the odor. You have enough to do trying to keep warm with one thin blanket and no heat. The only time I saw light was when the man opened the door to give me the mattress or meals. Though I couldn't communicate via visits or letters with anyone from the outside world, I could carry on a conversation with the even more unfortunate dudes on death row, or with those who'd been thrown in the other holes, by yelling through the vent and listening to what they shouted back through their vent. That is, unless someone was screaming to get out or throwing a fit. After 3 days, I didn't have the energy to carry on much small talk. My thoughts began to give way to fantasies about food, all kinds of food. I turned those slices of white bread into pound cake and eat them slowly, chewing each bite until it was liquid, savoring the delicious meal I was making of it in my mind. Years later, I heard a story about an Armenian woman who was being marched and starved out of her land by the Turkish army. She stayed alive by eating 1 pomegranate seed a day and imagining it to be a juicy slice of lamb. It was like that for me. At last, my 10 days were up and I saw light again. At first, painful for my unaccustomed eyes, but I wasn't released back in the population. The rule was that after a stint in the hole, a convict was sent upstairs to segregation, cell block 3. Compared to my recent dungeon life, cell block 3 seemed like the ward off, at least for the first day. There was plenty of light now, but in such an ugly, disintegrating place, it seemed a cruelty. I wasn't allowed any distractions either. No reading material, no luxury items from the canteen that made prison life more bearable, like cigarettes, candy bars, and Kool-Aid. I was still locked up all day and all night in a 6x9 cell, though with clothing and a bed this time, as well as a toilet that flushed in toilet paper. But there was no exercise, no fresh air. There was more food, hardly edible as it was. It was served on paper plates, and 99% of the time, it was cold because of the long trek from the kitchen to the cell block. The major diversions were shower time. 3 times a week, we got to walk the catwalk to the shower, stand under the running water for 5 minutes, and walk back to our cells. And the weekly 1-hour session called exercise time, when we'd be let out our cells, one at a time, to walk up and down the corridor and shoot the breeze with other inmates at the same tier. Radios weren't allowed, and there was no TV. 3 or 4 days out of 7, some con would entertain us all by stuffing a towel in his toilet and flooding the hallway with 3 or 4 inches of water. Since we weren't allowed out of our cells, the guards would have to clean it up while we got laughs out of watching them take off their shoes, roll up their pants, and mop away, cussing all the time. Aside from that, the only recreation available was writing endless numbers of letters or beating off 3 times a day to an imaginary lover. Sometimes a motherfucking puñeta. Sometimes the noise level would prevent either of these diversions. Inmates would start yelling at each other or at the guards or banging on the bars just for something to break the monotony. Idle time is rampant throughout the prison population, but in lockup and in the hole, there's nothing but idle time. And then there were the mind games the guards pulled. holding back the mail and taunting the convict with it, denying visiting privileges when the visitor was waiting downstairs after traveling 50 miles to spend her monthly hour talking with her son or lover or husband or brother. Every day in lockup, an inmate got fed a little more hate. After 2 weeks in cell block 3, the captain called me down to his office and told me he was going to put me back in the population. If I heard anyone else, he told me, I'd be locked up again. I was released from segregation that day and assigned to another dormitory, right below the first one I'd been in. The word had traveled. When I walked in, 2 black guys came up to me. Listen, man, we heard what happened upstairs. Don't worry about that happening here. We don't want that shit to come down, they assured me. I was given a lot of respect from that day on. I learned how to survive and got thick-skinned and tougher than I'd ever been in the days when I was committing the robberies that put me in the joint. That's why I ended up spending 9 years in the joint before I got parole. I became a member of the White Clique, which at the time hadn't turned into anything as serious as the Aryan Brotherhood. It was just a matter of power and numbers, and since there were so few of us in the pen, we let our solidarity be our strength. I had plenty of bad examples to follow. Bad in terms of the prissy image most of society has for the way a convict should learn to behave, but good for hardening me to the rude facts of prison existence. The administration itself fostered the hardcore education of inmates by throwing newcomers with only 1 to 5 year sentences in with someone who had a lot of time. 50, 100 years, maybe life. The lifer isn't any too pleased to be looking at a guy better off than he is, who's getting out in maybe 6 months. So there's tension between them. With so much idle time on their hands, that tension grows in their minds and soon they're at each other's throats. All of a sudden, this newcomer who may have come in just wanting to do his time peacefully and get out is staring at another 6 months tagged on to his sentence because the older con riled him up and the man labeled him the fish, our name for new inmates, a troublemaker. The administration, after all, has to be there with a lifer a lot longer than with the guy who's only doing 1 to 5, so the lifer gets consideration. The man may play sadistic games with the convicts, but he's also got his sly way of giving in to the power they wield. He doesn't want any outbreaks of rebellion that might catch the public's attention. This is another example to add to the long list of how little the prison officials care about rehabilitating the inmates. When I came in, there were honor units for the dudes who'd been there a long time and who were doing their stints peacefully. The administrators could have encouraged these old-timers to get together with the new arrivals and wise them up to what they were up against in population. Tell them how borrowing money or getting into any kind of debt could lead to their being beaten, stabbed, or becoming someone's kid, a jailhouse punk who runs errands, cleans house, gets butt fucked, or gives a blowjob whenever his owner wants. Or how hardcore cons put pressure on the families of the dudes who owe them money, writing to a friend on the streets that so-and-so owes them, which sends the friend to the guy's wife or relative saying, you gotta pay up on his debt or we're gonna beat his ass in the joint. These peaceful old-timers could have offered help to the newcomers in case any of these things came to pass, but they didn't, and the administration didn't encourage them to either. Nothing but survival to the strongest was encouraged in the penitentiary. It took 6 years for a hardcore training to throw me into a role I never expected to be in, that of a killer. I was head cook in the kitchen then. One Friday morning, a fish came in from quarantine to work in on the cleanup detail. He was a young, tall, muscular man fresh out of Vietnam who insisted on being called Eagle Beak and throwing his weight around to prove what a badass dude he was. He zeroed in on one of my regular Chicano helpers, hassling him all morning with racial innuendos that quickly turned into blatant obscenities and name-calling. My sidekick was handling his end of the abuses just fine, so I didn't step in, figuring the fish would talk himself out. But he got physical about it and pushed the Chicano against the wall. Hey, leave the kid alone, I yelled to him. Eagle Beak let go like he was holding a hot coal and came up to me. Okay, I'll let him alone, he said, then smacked me hard in the jaw with his fist. Common sense won over my instant reflex to kick the shit out of him. Aside from the fact that he was too large for me to successfully fight with my bare hands, I didn't want to get into it with him right there in the kitchen. I'd worked myself up into a good job, not easy to come by in prison, and I didn't want to blow it over some fish trying to prove he had balls. Man, that hurt. I wish you wouldn't do that anymore, I told him with ominous warnings in my voice. He got the message and didn't cause any more trouble for the rest of the day. The next morning was another matter though. I was chopping lettuce for the Sunday salad when Eagle Beak walked up threateningly close and said calmly, "I was thinking about what happened yesterday. I figured that the job I did on you wasn't good enough. Let's me and you get down and get it right this time." I kept on chopping and answered, "Man, I don't want to fight you." But he popped me again, this time with such force he made my nose bleed. He laughed when he saw the blood and started coming at me again. But the carving knife I was holding reached his belly first. It was a long French chef's knife. I just sharpened that morning and it pierced him clear through. He groaned and clutched his stomach and, after a few moments of staggering, crumpled to the floor. Someone had to go get the guard. He hadn't been around to hear the fight. Eagle Beak was taken to the hospital and I was sent to lockup while the administration investigated the event. Eagle Beak died 10 days later. After 2 weeks in segregation, I was called into the warden's office. To my amazement, he told me that they weren't going to press murder charges against me. Why? Because the district attorney didn't have a murder weapon. It seems the knife with which I killed Eagle Beak was the sharpest one in the kitchen. So the unthinking prison employee who was chief steward cleaned it off and went right on using it. When the DA came to the penitentiary to gather his evidence against me, he went to the kitchen and just blew a fuse when he saw the steward using it to cut a roast. Without the knife, there wasn't a case. I'd gotten tight enough with my co-workers that they didn't go for the man's promises of reward if they came up with a story that would earn a conviction. They just told the truth. It was self-defense, started by the victim. The warden closed our interview by saying, "Well, the guy is dead. He had no friends here, and I know he was picking on you. Do you think you can go back to the population and behave yourself?" Naturally, I answered yes. I didn't get convicted for the killing, but I did pay the prison price. It was on my record. The parole board denied my release for 3 more years. At that point, I didn't care. I was young and carried a "I don't give a fuck" attitude about everything except my own safety and sanity, which by then were well protected. I belonged to a strong clique, and after my bout with Eagle Beak, everyone, including myself, thought I was a hot shit, badass, hardcore motherfucker that nobody wanted to mess with. The administration thought so too, and instead of sending me back to a dormitory or a cell block in regular population, assigned me to the maximum security cell block 5, the toughest unit in the penitentiary. There, I got a postgraduate education in how to be the baddest bully in the joint. My teachers were the most incorrigible troublemakers there. Some were, at least to my mind, criminally insane. These men got their rocks off harassing other inmates so they could watch them snivel in fear. They never fought or fucked with each other, but they made it their goal to bulldog the rest of the prison population. In fact, they ran the place. Even the administration was afraid of them. The top echelon of the Chicano and white cliques lived in Southside Cell Block 5. A black in the cell block was unheard of. He wouldn't have lasted an hour. Even a white or Chicano couldn't move in without being co-signed by at least 2 other Cell Block 5 cons. That is, if he valued his life. No one ever tried voluntarily to bust up the party, but if they had, they'd be faced with 30 men, every one of them wielding a weapon of some sort, whether a pipe, straight razor, shop-made knife, or Molotov cocktail. My toughened up teachers had plenty of time on their hands to think about ways of getting and stashing their arsenals, and devise some cunning hiding places and smuggling schemes. The administration and guards knew all this was happening and would regularly shake down the dorms and cell blocks. It wasn't just the hardcore cell block inmates who stashed weapons, though they were the best armed men in the prison. But for every weapon discovered, there were 2 more to take its place. The convicts took their stash of weapons seriously. It was their main power, and often it had saved a dude's ass or a life in a fight. as the pipe had for me when I first arrived in the prison. The man looked the other way for the most part, as long as these arsenals weren't being used by inmates against other inmates. It's only when rumors of a riot came down that the administration made a real effort to find them. All things considered, the inmates of Cell Block 5 were left alone to work over whomever they wanted, as long as they didn't get in the man's way. In fact, the administration used Cell Block 5 to do a lot of their dirty work for them. One house in the cell block was always left free so that a new arrival, a fish who'd been giving the guards a hard time, could be thrown in there for a day. Sometimes two, to scare him. And it would scare the poor bastard alright. The kid would catch hell, get beaten, kicked, raped, yelled at, and robbed. He'd come out of that cell in a state of shock, wondering what he did to deserve being thrown in with such a bunch of maniacs. I've seen them dribbling at the mouth with eyes rolled up in their heads when the man finally came and took them away. I remember one kid who'd just been transferred from Arizona. He thought he was a big shot, so the guards threw him in the empty cell. As soon as the man left, someone got out his pipe and started in on the kid, hitting him with it all the way down the catwalk to the cell block doorway. He was taken out of there and spent a considerable amount of time in the infirmary. The beating struck so much fear in him that he asked to do the rest of his time locked up in the protection unit, which he did. Motherfucker went to PC. Anyone who asked for lockup and protection got it, but he'd have to sign a waiver releasing the penitentiary from any responsibility for what happened to him if he ever wanted to go back in the population. Protection is also a 24-hour lockup, no exercise stint, that shot a man's reputation to hell. Anyone who chose not to stand up and fight, but to hide instead in the protection unit with the snitches and baby rapers was despised. He was considered weak, the one thing survivors never allowed themselves to be. Besides taking care of the administration troublemakers, the men of Cell Block 5 specialized in personal paybacks. Anyone who burned them or their friends was in for disaster. In the joint, where there's little else to think about, old grudges grow to vendetta proportions. One day, a Cell Block 5 resident, I'll call Barnes, got word that an old buddy who burned him on the streets for $300 worth of dope had just come out of quarantine into the population. Barnes got two friends to lure the dude up to the cell block, where only someone new in the joint would dare to go. As they were bringing him up, inmates in quarantine, which at that time was in Cell Block 4, just across the hall from 5, started warning him not to go in there, but it was too late. Barnes and 10 of his close bros were standing in the middle of the catwalk waiting. The Welcher was pushed toward them and dragged into a cell where the 11 men did a job on him. He kept yelling for help, but it didn't do him any good. Only one guard was on duty, and he stood at the cell block entrance asking what was going on. He knew very well what was happening, but he was too chicken shit to come in. Instead, he headed to the office phone to call for assistance. He was stopped by 4 Chicanos who'd been stationed to watch for just a possibility. They got to him just as he was about to dial. Surrounding but not touching him, they warned, "Man, you better get the fuck off the phone and disappear for a while, or we're gonna get you on the floor too." The officer knew they meant it and split. He couldn't have done anything for the Welcher anyway. By then, the poor guy was nearly beaten to death. His teeth were knocked out, both eyes were blackened, and his nose was broken and bloody. When they were finished working him over, Barnes and his 10 buddies dragged the unconscious Welcher across the hall and dumped him back in Cell Block 4 quarantine. All 30 residents of Cell Block 5 followed, myself included, walking into quarantine as we lived there. A few noses were busted and eyes darkened before Barnes stopped the action to ask, "Okay, any of you friends of this guy? Any of you want to speak up for him?" There was silence. Though there were 70 of them and only 30 of us, we'd completely subdued them. Barnes decided that while he was there, he might as well take a little treasure. Shaking a pillow out of his case, he announced, "Okay, every one of you sons of bitches throw your canteen into this sack." Each of us grabbed ourselves a pillowcase and got into the act, walking up and down the catwalk in partners, going into each cell and strong-arming every one of the quarantines for their precious stashes and valuables. Everyone except the 4 or 5 old timers back in the old repeats. But the newcomers were told, come on, load it up. All your smoke, son, and give me that watch off your arm and that ring. We left with at least 15 sacks full of food, cigarettes, and jewelry. Not until we were back in cell block 5 did a guard show up on the scene asking if everything had cooled down. He was told that everything was cool, but there was a pretty sick fish passed out in quarantine. After he left to check it out, we could hear the guys in 4 yelling to him. They robbed us. Those motherfuckers, they creamed us. The screw told them he thought they were exaggerating and that they'd be better off forgetting the whole thing. Cell Block 5 was victorious again. Instead of getting thrown in the hole for our violence, that night we partied with $500 worth of smokes, candy, Kool-Aid, potato and taco chips, cocoa, and the instant coffee that we pillaged, and made deals for the rings and watches that were part of the booty. From then on, the fishes in quarantine had trouble keeping their canteen. They'd go to the store, get their weekly supply of goodies, and get zapped when they came down the main corridor toward the unit. It didn't matter how big or how small he was. The average fish got ripped off. Only if he was an old timer was he let go. Sometimes the fish would put up a fight, but it would be madness to try to do battle with 10 dudes at once. The guards continued to look the other way. I guess they figured that if those hardcore cons in 5 were keeping themselves happy, taking away canteens, they wouldn't be hassling them. In the 14 years I was at the pen, there were many turnovers in Cell Block 5 residents, but they always carried on in the same bulldog manner, and they did it stoned. Most of the cons in Cell Block 5 stayed high on some kind of drug 7 days a week. Drugs in the joint were no problem at all, especially for these guys. If you had cash, there was always some underpaid guard eager to make a fast buck and ready to supply you with whatever you needed. And there was a lot of green money floating around the penitentiary, smuggled in during visits, through the legal mail, or via an inmate coming in from the honor unit. Lots of new rivals who were wise would get the stash, hide in their rectum their cash. They got away with it because in New Mexico, there weren't any probing cavity checks. Perhaps because the Catholic upbringing of the mostly Chicano administration and their macho ethic made such precautions repugnant. A bag of grass costing $25 on the street went for $150 in the joint. You could likewise buy heroin or acid. Cocaine was rare to come by. Commercial booze was also available from guards. But if you weren't flush, there was always homemade brew, the staple intoxicant of every prison. Cell Block 5 always had a steady supply of home brew coming in. It could be made anywhere, though in the kitchen most naturally, since that's where all the ingredients were. The fixings could be smuggled into the dormitories or cell blocks and put together there. When I worked in the kitchen, we'd take a gallon of either raw potatoes, tomato puree, raisins, or anything else that was available, and let it ferment in something large like a 5-gallon milk can, filling it with 2/3 of water and 10 pounds of sugar. Then we'd mix in raw rising dough or yeast from the bakery to get the brew cooking. Stir all of that together, cover it, and put it in a warm place for 3 or 4 days until it was ready. It tasted about as good as the ingredients sound, but in the joint, it seemed as fine as champagne. When I came back on a new conviction after being paroled in 1974, I decided it was time I grew up. The prison had gotten even worse. It was so overcrowded that there weren't enough jobs or programs to keep the inmates even minimally occupied. Idleness was the major activity. Hundreds of men sat around the day rooms and dormitories all day long with nothing to do but shoot the shit and scheme on how to get over on the man or how to work over some personal or racial enemy. Besides the idle time, the sardine-like living conditions were giving the cons a lot to be angry about. Researchers at the Yale School of Medicine did a study that proved scientifically, in case no one had noticed the real-life proof, the dangerous effects of overcrowded dormitories in prison. They found that inmates living in this situation experienced an increase in blood pressure, that overcrowding caused stress and tension and required a high degree of vigilance by inmates, which involved a lot of personal control and disrupted social relationships. The most natural way to express the frustration was to find a scapegoat. Prison, it's often said, is a reflection of society, and society isn't finished with its racial prejudices. Those prejudices had rubbed off on every convict when he was on the streets, and he carried them into prison with him, where the pressure made his bigotry a mountain of resentment. Seldom were there out and out race wars with 10 or more members of each clique fighting each other. Most often, clique grudges were carried out in one-to-one stabbings. The majority of bigotry battles were waged by attitude and talk and organization. The rising crime rate had brought more whites and blacks into the penitentiary. By 1980, 53% of the population was Chicano, Hispanic, 37% Anglo, 9% black, and 1% Indian. The edge was not just in population numbers for Chicanos. Most of the prison personnel were of Hispanic origin. In the early days, when 75% of the inmates were Chicano, the man looked on them as ordinary convict scum and treated them like the same pieces of dirt as the other convicts. Now that the administration and guards had scapegoats, not only for their pretensions of self-righteousness, but for their racial prejudices as well, they began to show favoritism toward their Chicano brothers. This didn't make the Anglos, once allies, feel any too safe with the Chicano clique. Though there had been a white clique all along, it wasn't until 1973 when bikers from the West Coast began to get busted in New Mexico for running drugs cross country that the hardcore Aryan Brotherhood began to get a grip on the whites. The bikers reacted strongly to being the underdog too, as they would say, an inferior race of Mexicans. They also got a lot of heat from everyone in the joint, Chicanos, blacks, the administration, even some whites, because everyone was leery of the ominous and infamous legend of bikers. They decided to form their own group, a prison motorcycle club without the choppers, to be sure their backs were covered in case any of their numerous enemies decided to be brave. As the California bikers began to come into the prison in greater numbers, they started touting the Aryan Brotherhood. Why just form a clique for bikers, they argued. There's power in numbers. Let's get the AB in, and all the white bros in the joint can join. They wrote to the California headquarters of the American Nazi Party for the right to open a chapter in the penitentiary in New Mexico, got permission, and soon just about every white con in the place was a full-fledged member. For the first time in the prison's history, the whites had a clique to equal the long-standing Mexican mafia of the Chicanos. The blacks, the brunt of both cliques' hatred, got themselves aligned with the black Muslims. The more politically oriented Black Panthers never gained a foothold in Santa Fe as they had in most other American prisons, because here blacks were the minority. Most of the convicts who belonged to these cliques were not only uneducated, they looked down on anyone who tried to be better themselves. They aimed to make everyone believe they were cold, bad motherfuckers, and their attitude was, no bad motherfucker would go to school. They all cited bigotry of one kind or another as the reason they were in the joint. The blacks thought that they were there because of their color. The Chicanos said they were there because of the Anglos, who'd been oppressing Hispanics since they invaded their land 100 years ago. The whites said they wouldn't be in the joint if they'd had the bucks for high-powered attorneys. Most of them were unwilling to take any responsibility for their situation. They talk about the unfairness of society and the man, but never admit to playing the same game when they infringed on a new convict's freedom by hassling him for protection. They talk about the unfairness of society and the man, but never admit to playing the same game when they infringed on a new convict's freedom by hassling him for protection, money, or a piece of ass. Let a guard put them in the hole for some of their carrying ons, though, and they'd be the first to snivel that they were being treated unfairly. I criticized them like ex-alcoholics criticize a drunkard, because watching them was like watching a part of myself I wanted to forget. I'm not excusing society for its part in shaping a criminal or denying that the prison administration destroys a man's morale and often his mind. But I'm not letting the clique heavies off the hook either. They do just as much to stop growth and keep anger festering. It's from their ranks that the cruelest rioters came. the ones who would commit atrocities no animal but the human would think of.